Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kiwi College. I'm Sarah Smith, the editorial director of Kiwi, and I'm very pleased to see all of you here, and I'm very happy to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Susan Bartel. Dr. Bartel, who's a Kiwi Advisory Board member, is a nationally renowned psychologist and author who's been helping kids and families lead healthier, happier lives for nearly 20 years. She's the author of many books, including Dr. Susan's Fit and Fun Family Action Plan, and most recently of 2 editions of the Top 50 Questions Kids Ask. One is for pre-K through 2nd grade, and the other is for 3rd through 5th grade. These are just excellent books, and I'm really excited that you're all going to be able to get a sneak peek into them tonight. And don't forget, if you're able to stay with us for the whole webinar, you'll be entered to win one. I also want to let you all know that Dr. Bartel has a wonderful parenting newsletter that you can sign up for on her website, which is drsusanbartel.com. So today, she's going to help us figure out why kids ask the questions they ask and how to answer them. She'll also be taking your questions throughout her talk at a few different points, as well as at the end. So please feel free to type in and send your questions our way at any point. So for right now, I would like to thank Dr. Bartel for being here and turn things over to her.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's great to be here with you at Kiwi College and with everybody else. And I definitely have to admit that this is my first webinar I've ever given. So, except for the one that I gave yesterday morning, which I think went kind of smoothly. So hopefully tonight will be just as smooth. So let's get started, why don't we? And let's talk about children's questions and what we can learn from them. We all know that as your child grows physically, it's a really predictable path. For example, your child reaches a certain height. You take them to the doctor, and they tell you how much they're growing and that it's reaching a predictable height. They reach predictable weight milestones. They do certain things that they're supposed to do, like sit and stand and throw a ball. Those are all physical milestones. And in addition to that, your kids grow cognitively and emotionally in a predictable way as well. For example, when you send your child to nursery school and then elementary school, first they learn colors, then they learn ABCs, they learn reading, they learn writing and math. All of that is cognitive change that happened in a very predictable way. And emotionally, change is also very predictable. So, for example, your child, social change is part of emotional change. Your child at first, when they're very tiny, likes to play alone. And they're very interested in a ball or something that they're playing with, and that makes them very happy to play alone. Then as they get a little bit older, they'll want to play side by side with another child or with you. And that's called parallel play. And then when they get older still, they really want to play with another child interactively. And that's the way we see social and emotional change happen predictably. So what's really fascinating is that the type of questions that your child asks reflect these cognitive, social, and emotional changes. And so if you can see when you look here, it says that the questions your child asks are a window into his or her mind and heart. It's really because when you tune in and listen really hard to those questions, it helps you to understand where your child is in those social and emotional and even cognitive stages of development. And, you know, I've always wished that I had a little tiny door to look into the brain of my 3 children. But when you listen to their questions, it's kind of like that little door, and it helps you to see right inside to know what they're thinking, and a little bit about what's ticking in there. So let's go on now, and let's see. And we know, of course, that all children ask questions, tons of questions. I know my kids haven't stopped asking questions since the day they were born. But the thing is that the way we answer questions can really make an enormous difference in your relationship with your child. It's amazing when you think about it, and we often don't stop to think about it. So, for example, answering questions in the right way can improve communication between you and your child. Let's think about it. Your child, I'm going to give you some of the top 50 questions that kids ask. One of them, for example, is, where do babies come from? I'm sure you can imagine that that was a very common question, and I bet some of you out there have heard it. Now, ask yourself, when your child asks you sticky questions like that, about where do babies come from, questions about sex, any of those squeamish questions that you don't want to hear, do you answer them or do you run away from them? Well, if you answer them in an open way, that will really improve communication between you and your child. But if you run away from them because they're too hard for you to answer, that can shut down communication. And we're going to talk later on in this session about how to improve communication even more in the questions and answers that you give your child. But think about that one. The way you answer questions can really empower your child to think in a different way. So here's another example. One of the questions that I got in the book was, where do people go after they die? Now that's a tough question because for us as parents, it's hard to think about death. But kids are really curious about that. And one of the things you might want to do is you might want to say to them, well, tell me what you think. Where do you think people go after they die? What that does, it really helps your child's brain to expand. Rather than by you giving them the answer that you think is the best answer, it gives your child the opportunity to think about what they think is the best answer. And then it gives you the ability to say to them, you know what, I think you could be right. I think that's a great answer. And so they are able to feel, you know what, I'm a good thinker too. I don't always need my mom or dad to tell me what the answers are. I can think of my own answers. And the way you answer your kids' questions can really encourage them to become more and more curious. So here's another question. This wasn't in the top 50 questions books, of course, but kids are asking so many questions today about the oil spill. So one of the questions I'm hearing a lot from kids and parents is, how come the spill of oil doesn't just run out? Why does it keep pouring out and pouring out without running out? And one of the things you might say to your child is, well, why don't we investigate that together? And that will help your child to learn that, you know what, we can be curious. We don't have to have a pat answer to questions. We can ask more questions, and we can really learn the answers from them. So the way you answer questions really does help your child to become terrifically more interested, more independent, and more curious. Okay. Now, of course, when I was writing the top 50 questions kids ask, there was the #1 question in the nationwide survey that I gave parents. What do you think the #1 question was? Anyone can guess? I'm going to reveal it right now. Here it comes. I think you're going to be surprised because I was actually quite surprised at what the #1 question was. What's for dinner? Now, I was actually quite taken aback by that, and it's got me really thinking about what that question means. And it got me thinking in general about really trying to understand the underlying reasons that kids sometimes ask questions. So let's look at this one, for example. Sometimes kids are just curious, what's for dinner? And they want to know it's something that they like. But I think very often when I talk to parents about dinner time and what's going on at dinner time, this question, what's for dinner, is a grounding question for children. What they are really asking you is, what's going on? Who's making dinner tonight? Is dinner going to be at home? What time are we having dinner? Is it going to be at 5 o'clock? Is it going to be at 7 o'clock? Is dinner running late? Are we all going to be at the table for dinner? They want to know, because dinner time is potentially a family time, they want to know and be sure that it's not going to be hectic and crazy, or if it is, they want to be prepared for that. Sometimes kids are even asking what's for dinner as a way to remind their parents to remember to make dinner or pick up something for dinner on the way home from work. So when we look below the surface at questions our kids ask, like what's for dinner, and we understand why that is such a common question, it helps us to really think about when our kids are asking us frequent questions, we have to understand and think about, now, why are they asking me that question over and over and over again? So now, let's talk a little bit about these books, and I want to help you to understand, sort of a lot more about the questions that kids ask. So what I did was, in putting the books together, was the first thing I did was I interviewed parents across the whole country. I sent a survey out across the country and actually even out of the country. It's possible that some of you out there even got my survey and answered my questions. And I got back so many answers from parents with the types of questions their kids ask. The most common questions that your kids ask you was what I asked parents. And I saw in the responses I got that I was able to sort the questions into different age groups. The first was the pre-K through second, because that's a natural developmental stage, and the second was third through fifth, which is another natural developmental stage. And what's really important to understand for this and for everything else having to do with development is that there's a huge range of normal development, and that kids from pre-K through fifth grade and before that and beyond that, a child in pre-K could be asking questions that a child in fifth grade might be asking, and vice versa. So you always need to think that just because your child may not be doing something another child is doing, whether it's questions or something else, it doesn't mean your child is not normal. Or if your child is asking things that seem more advanced than another child, it doesn't mean that your child isn't normal. So then, after sorting the questions into these two groups and into age groups, I started to see that the questions naturally fell into categories, as I was saying in the beginning, that reflect normal development. And the categories were really interesting in that kids have certain types of questions that they ask, and that's the part that made me feel like I was getting that tiny little look into kids' brains. So there was a whole group of questions that were about fears, for example. There was another whole group of questions about God and spirituality, another whole group of questions about friendships and social life, and those became the chapters of the books. So it was really interesting to see how, in fact, it was almost like a little study to understand how, in fact, kids' questions so naturally and normally reflect the way they are developing that as a parent, if you really tune yourself into that, you will definitely be able to understand your kids. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about 3 of these chapters, if you will, 3 of these types of questions. We can't go through every single one because we don't have time, but we're going to look at 3 types of questions kids ask, and we're going to understand the best ways to answer them, what they mean and the best ways to answer them. So let's get started. Okay, so the first types of questions we're going to look at are the who's in charge questions. These are the questions about setting limits and boundaries. So for example, I'm sure these are all common questions to everybody. Can I stay up later? This is one of my favorites. Do I have to take a shower? I took one yesterday. How come my friends can see a PG movie 13 and I can't? Can I watch TV? Why can't you leave me alone? That's a common one. So let's look at these questions. One of the most interesting things about them is that very often kids will keep pushing boundaries and asking you questions about pushing boundaries because they don't feel like you meant something when you said it. So you see that I said there, I said no, but did I mean it? Very often, parents aren't saying something with conviction, either because they don't feel the conviction or because they're not saying it firmly enough. And so, like, one of the examples that I like to talk about a lot here is the one about everybody is seeing a PG-13 movie. How come I can't? And if you look at the bottom, I wrote there, everyone else really isn't, I promise you. Because kids tend to ask that question in that way so often that it makes you doubt your convictions. But the truth is, when it comes to issues like that, it's very important to have strong convictions and to be very, very consistent. Because things like media, for example, movies, TV, videos, the internet, for you to have strong boundaries means that you're protecting your child and keeping them safe. And if you let those boundaries become lax, you're going to expose your child to things like sexuality and violence that once it's inside their brain, you can never shake it out of their brain. And there is a lot of research that shows that those type of things impact on a child in very negative ways. So it's very important to be consistent and not to be swayed by your child's peer pressure or even by your own peer pressure from other parents who may be very lax in allowing their kids to see movies or videos or TV shows that are well beyond the age that they should be. So then, on the other hand, there are many areas that you could have some flexibility. So let's look at the question, do I have to take a shower tonight? Perhaps that particular night, your child didn't get that dirty. It was an indoor day. School was sort of, not so sweaty. And you might want to say, you know what, no, you don't have to take a shower tonight. It's an opportunity for you to be flexible, to give your child some control, and to save your being in charge and to save your strict boundary setting for when they're asking you a question where you really feel like you need to set a firm limit. So it's very important, for you to pick and choose your battles when your child is asking you questions that have to do with boundaries. So I'm going to stop here now at the end of this section, and I'm going to see if Sarah has any questions from anybody.
We do. We have a couple questions.
Good.
Well, we have someone who asked, what should I do if I've said no to something like a movie, but then my child saw it at a friend's house? So can you talk about how to deal with that with your kid, maybe with the other family too?
Sure, absolutely. That's a very, very common issue. And certainly, particularly if your child is going to someone else's house, there's going to be times for sure when people have different standards than you have. And in particular, you have to be careful not to overreact to that. You don't want your child to feel that they have to keep secrets from you. So, if your child comes home and says, I saw a PG-13 movie or I even saw an R movie, you need to be careful not to say you were angry or that it was terrible of that family to let them let your child see that movie. You want to have a very metered response to that. And what you really want to do, the most important thing, is talk to your child about what the movie was about, what they saw in it, and ask them if they have any questions. And remind them that in your family, you have different standards about what kind of things, but that it's not the biggest deal in the world that they were at someone else's house and happened to see something you didn't like. So you want to have a response that's not going to make them feel like they need to lie to you or hide it, or that it was the most horrible thing, but also that they know that in general, when they're with you, that that's not what you guys do.
Okay, great, thanks. What about if my child challenges me in public, challenges my authority?
Ah, yes. Very, very good question. And again, something that happens very frequently. In fact, I was talking to a mom today who was having that exact issue. She was in my office earlier talking about that. I think when a child challenges you in public, there's a couple of things going on. First of all, it's embarrassing for you. So your first response might be to want to give in because you want to end the embarrassment immediately. And your child knows that, and so they are trying to do it in a way that's going to make you give in. And what you really need to do is you need to still continue to stand firm, and in an ideal situation, to remove your child quietly and firmly from the situation and talk to them privately and remind them that challenging you in public, even if they're having a temper tantrum, isn't going to change your mind. So you need to do your best to kind of steel yourself against the embarrassed feelings you might be having, but not allow that to manipulate you into changing your mind.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
One more on this subject looks like when I'm flexible about a rule, do I need to explain to my child why?
Yes, I think that's great. I think that the more you talk and explain, the better you're going to have communication. So if you normally don't have flexibility, but in this particular situation you want to have some flexibility, I think it's great to explain it to your child. And you can explain that this isn't necessarily going to be the case always, because sometimes kids kind of will latch onto a flexible moment and try and leverage it in every other moment possible. So you need to be clear that, you know what, I'm allowing you to stay up 15 minutes late tonight, but I'm not going to let you stay up 15 minutes late every night. We're doing it tonight because you don't have school tomorrow, or because there's a show on tonight that you really wanted to watch badly, or because you slept late tonight and I can see you're not tired. But I certainly don't expect you to ask me every night or to have a fit tomorrow night when I tell you have to go to sleep at your bedtime. So I think that's great to do that, and it'll help you to not have your child be, angry and have different expectations if you do communicate clearly with them why you're being flexible.
All right, great. All right, thank you.
Good. So should we move on now?
Yes, let's move.
Okay. So the next topic we're going to cover is the topic about fear questions. And questions about fear are, again, very, very common and very, very normal. And I say that because there are some kids who never, ever have fears, and there are some kids who have a lot of fears. And there are parents who are very anxious when their kids have fears. Now, fears usually begin, developmentally speaking, parents might begin to see fears around 3 or 4 years old, and typically they will start to wear away by the early elementary years. If your child has fears that seem like they're kind of infiltrating every area of life and making it very, very difficult for your child and even for your family to go about regular things on a normal basis, it's important not to ignore them. So, for example, if your child can't have sleepovers at someone else's house, an older child, or is so paralyzed by a fear of dogs that they won't go to somebody's house, or starts to become afraid to go to school because they're afraid to leave you. They have separation anxiety that makes them so afraid to leave you they won't go to school. If they're terrified, absolutely terrified of the doctor and, incapacitated and won't go, fears that don't get smaller but get bigger, you need to consider getting some professional help for those type of fears, because sometimes what parents don't understand is that unmanaged, out-of-control fears tend to get bigger and bigger and bigger over time rather than smaller and smaller. So if they don't seem to be taking on a gradually disappearing path, but rather a gradually increasing path, it's a good idea to reach out for some help. Okay, so now, some of the fears that came up in the Top 50 Questions books that I want to sort of give you as examples and talk about a little bit are, who's going to take care of me if you die? That was one of the normal questions that we heard. And it's an interesting question because it came from so many parents and so many kids. And parents are often pretty afraid of that question. When we talk about death, we as adults get kind of squeamish, especially if our kids are asking us questions about our own death. But for kids, it's a very practical question. Of course, they don't want us to die. It's the last thing they want. But they want to know that if something did happen to us, they really do want to know who will be there to tuck them in at night, who will be there to make their breakfast and their school lunch. And so for them, it's very practical. And it's really important for you as a parent to have a response for them. So, and by a response, I mean a plan. So you need to know who would be a guardian for your child if something did happen to you. And not only is it important for your child, but in fact, if you don't have a will that states who will take care of your child, they could actually be awarded to the state until something got worked out. So it is really important to make sure that you have guardians in place for your child and that it's written in a will. And then to explain to your child who that person is and how it would work, and that the person knows they are that person, and that everything is set in place. And normally when your child understands that you've taken care of that, that fear dissipates. Here's another question that was a very common question. Are you going to get a divorce? Kids ask that question for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes they ask it because their parents are really going to get a divorce, and they've heard conversations, and the parents don't realize they've heard conversations because they thought their kids weren't listening or were sleeping. If that's the case, you need to address it directly with your child. If it's not the case, then often that question is a red flag that you're fighting a lot in front of your child, or at night when you think they're sleeping but they're not. And it's important to think about how your behavior might be impacting on your child that's making them ask you that question. And for kids, listening to their parents fight and fight and fight, especially if it's very intense fighting, can be very scary. And them asking you that question is a signal to you that they're scared. Another question that was a very common question was, is this going to hurt? Getting a shot, even having a Band-Aid pulled off, all different things can hurt for kids. And those kind of questions, it's really very important not to lie to your child. I think sometimes we, as parents, want to protect our child from feelings of fear, and so we might tell them, no, it's not going to hurt to get your ear pierced, or it's not going to hurt to get that shot, because we want to spare them that scared feeling. But the reality is that if we lie to them and then it does hurt, they won't trust us after that, the next time. And trust is much more important in a relationship between you and your child than a feeling of fear, a momentary fear. So on the other hand, of course, you don't want to terrorize them, so you want to give them a response that makes them feel what's realistically going to happen in a way that they can handle. So say something like, you know what, the shot's going to hurt a little bit, but I know that you can handle it, and I'm going to hold your hand if you want me to, and you can squeeze it as hard as you like, but you know what, it's really important for you to get this shot because it's going to stop you from getting a really bad illness, and you can squeeze my hand as hard as you want, and it's going to be over before you know it. So it's being realistic, but being calming at the same time. Or something like, you know what, it's not going to pinch for a second when you get your ears pierced, but you really want your ears pierced, and you're going to love it afterwards, so it's worth that pinch. So being calming and realistic together is what your kid needs from you, and what you need to give them in order for them to trust you. Another question that I get a lot from children is, are there monsters in my room? You know, fears of the dark kinds of questions. Are there monsters? Are there ghosts? And sometimes parents want to respond to those questions by checking under the bed and then telling their child there's no monsters under your bed, going through the whole closet, leaving the closet door open, sometimes even removing the bed frill from their child's bed. I had a parent recently who took the entire closet door off and took it out of the bedroom because their child was afraid that a monster could still get in. And although other parents I know make a bottle of pretend monster spray and spray it around the room, and although those things will work momentarily to help a child, the reality is that what they actually do is they reinforce the idea that, yes, there are monsters in your room, and so we have to do these things to get rid of the monsters. What your child really needs from you is a clear message that there is nothing to be afraid of. We don't need to check the closets. We don't need to check under the bed. We don't need to spray monster spray because there are no monsters. Your house is safe. I keep you safe, or we keep you safe, and you're going to be fine, and you can help yourself go to sleep, and you don't have to worry about the monsters because there are no monsters. And that's the message that you need to give your child, not that we're going to do something to get rid of the monsters, because they're never going to stop being afraid of monsters then. So I think that, you know, hopefully it's sort of the theme that you're hearing here is that you need to give your child some control over the situation rather than reinforcing the things that they're afraid of. And so I think I'm going to stop here again and see if we have any fear-related questions that anybody has.
All right, we do. We have a question about monsters.
Okay.
I use monster spray for my child. What should I do now?
Okay. Let's see. Well, I think what you probably should do is you should tell your child, you know what, we don't need the monster spray anymore because the monsters are gone. And moving forward from there, you just need to keep emphasizing and re-emphasizing that there are no monsters. And kids are very, very flexible. I mean, that's one of the amazing things about kids is how flexible they are and how able they are to shift into new ways of thinking. So it's okay that you've used monster spray, and it's okay that even if you've been doing it for years, it's easy to say to your child, and if you have the conviction, they will too, that there are no monsters in our house anymore. And we don't need the monster spray anymore, and we can retire the monster spray.
Great.
And
okay.
our house is safe. Yeah.
Great. All right, we have another question from a listener. Isn't there an age when giving too much explanation is not helpful?
Very, very young kids certainly don't need too much explanation. And in fact, in some situations, all kids don't need too much explanation. So it depends on the situation. You know, definitely there are times, and I've had this with kids I've worked with and with my own children, where I realize that they're asking me questions is just manipulative, and my explaining isn't really helping them. You know, they're just getting more frustrated, and really they just need me to set the limit and the boundary, and that's it, and they're not going to be happy because whatever they wanted is not going to happen no matter how much I explain it. What they want me to do is change my mind. And so at some point, it's fine to just say, look, we're done talking about this. I've given you my answer, and it's not changing. And certainly with very young kids, you know, 3- and 4-year-olds, very little explanation is necessary because cognitively, even really bright little kids don't really understand that much explanation. So you don't have to give them a lot of explanation. So yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Okay, great. We have one more interesting question. When my kids' friends ask the tough questions, and I know they don't get honest answers at home. Can I answer them honestly and the way I would answer my own kids' questions?
That's a great question. I think, you have to be very careful about that. Very, very, very careful. You can't put your values onto someone else's children. So you definitely have to be careful what the question is, especially when it comes to things like questions about sex, questions about where do babies come from, questions about the big topics of life. You always have to, if you're hearing from a child that the answers they've heard from their parents are different than the answers you've given your child, I don't think that you can give them an answer that's different than what they've been hearing at home. I think it's very important to respect where other people are coming from in the way they're raising their children, even if you don't agree with it, even if you think it's wrong. They are raising their children the way they want to. If it's something minor, then it's fine. But certainly in the same way as we may not want someone else to expose our child to an R movie or to something we're not ready to tell them yet, we don't want to do that to other people's children either. So I think that can be sticky, and I think certainly I've had parents recently. I gave a talk actually, not a webinar but a live talk, and someone asked a question very similar to that. She had told her child about where babies come from, and not where babies came from, but she had told her child about what sex was exactly, specifically. Her child had wanted to know, and she told her child, but her child's best friend didn't know, and she had to tell her child not to talk to her friend about it because the other mother wasn't ready to tell her yet.
Interesting. And let's say mom had a quick follow-up. What about when her child is in the room? How do you handle it then?
When her own child is in the room, or the other
child is in the room, and a child asks a question or seems to have some incorrect knowledge, incorrect information from their parents. So how do you sort of handle that?
I think you have to change the subject. I think that you have to change the subject, and then you have to say to your child, and sometimes your child might try and correct it, and it can get sticky. But you have to say, you might just have to be very direct with the two children and say to your child, different people have different ways of answering this question, or there are different ways of thinking about this, and different families have different ways of answering this question. So let's, why don't we go and have some ice cream now?
Great.
And
Great.
Just really because you have to be careful not to step on other parents' toes.
Right.
And you may have to say to your child, you know what, that's not a topic we can talk about with this child. Later on, you may have to privately say, because they have a different answer than we do for that question. Mm-hmm. And we have to respect other people's way of thinking. And I think that's a life lesson for your child, to have tolerance for the way other people think. That just because we do it this way doesn't mean everyone does it this way. And it's okay to be tolerant of other people. We don't have to agree with everybody on the way they do things. We can still be friends.
Great. All right, we have one last question. I know we have other areas to cover, but one last question on fears.
Yeah.
We can't seem to convince our daughter that weather events like tornadoes and hurricanes are not going to be an issue where we live.
Yeah.
But she continues to be terrified of them and doesn't even like to read about them in books. Is there any better wording that we could try to help her understand this?
Yeah, and I think that is a very, very common fear. Unfortunately, we live in a world where everything feels local. The media of our world is bringing everything, no matter how global it is, local to us. So, for example, when an earthquake happens in Haiti, suddenly our school is mobilizing to collect money to send, to Haiti. And so kids who are in the school start to feel like Haiti is next door. And if Haiti is next door, that earthquake could happen here. So the sense that that child that you're reading to me about is feeling is has become, and I've seen an enormous trend, so for this mom to understand that her child is not alone, it's a very common trend that I've been seeing, that kids are experiencing this feeling that things that are happening everywhere in the world could happen to them. And I feel like it has so much to do with not only the media, but the way that we are mobilizing as this like local, global community. And there are positive things about it, but there are also negative things about it, that it makes kids fearful. And it's very important to address it and to say to kids in a very concrete way that where we live right now is not a place that tornadoes come to. There are certain types of places in the world where tornadoes come to, but they don't come to where we live. We don't live in a part of the world where nature shows itself as tornadoes. Nature doesn't come here as tornadoes. So even though, or as earthquakes, that's not the way nature expresses itself here in this part of the world. So you have to be very concrete with your child and help them to understand, because what they're experiencing is the sense that we're so close to, it feels to them that we're so close to all these places, and they need to understand. You might want to take out a map and show it to them on a map. You might want to try and help them to understand that if you got on a plane and drove to even somewhere else in the United States, it would take X number of hours in the car to get to that place. That's how far away we are. And where we are, that's not going to happen. That's not how nature as a tornado doesn't come here like that. I think that's a way for a child to understand it.
Great. Thank you. Those are all our questions for this section.
Okay, good. So let's move on to the last in this category, the nagging questions, my favorite questions. We get them all day long, every day. Certainly I get them from my 3 children, multiplied by 3. And kids nag us because nagging works extremely well. They nag and they nag and they nag. One of my kids keeps tapping me. Her nagging comes in the form of her tapping me with her pointer finger on my shoulder. That's her form of tap, 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 tap when she wants something. And I know that she's nagging me about whatever she wants. So the kinds of questions that are nagging questions are we there yet? Can we get a dog was one of the big ones. Where is my notebook? Where are my shoes? Can you do this with me? Why? Well, the why questions, we all know the nagging questions. So what's really interesting about nagging questions, other than the fact that it's important to think about the fact that kids do them because they work, is that very often kids nag because they feel, even though it may not be accurate, they feel that their emotional needs aren't being met. And it might not be true, but that's sometimes how they feel. So, for example, if you're paying attention to somebody else, another child, maybe you have a baby, and you're paying a lot of attention to the baby, they may start to nag and nag and nag because it's a way of getting your attention, right? At that moment, they're feeling like that's the only way they could get their need for attention met. So nagging is a way to pull you away, even if the attention they're getting is negative attention. Sometimes it works, and they're willing to take negative attention over no attention because they know you're going to blow up when they've nagged you long enough. Sometimes, very often in fact, nagging is suppressed or repressed anger. So if you think about it, for example, kids know that they're not allowed to get angry with you. They know, and I love this picture. I love that picture of that little girl pulling on her ponytail. It's a good one. Kids know that they're not allowed, and of course some kids do it anyway, but they know that it's not socially acceptable to scream and yell and carry on and freak out at you when you're saying no to them about something, or if they want something from you and you're not paying attention to them. But nagging is a more socially acceptable way of behaving. And so what happens is they take all their angry feelings and they push them down and squelch them, and they come out as whining, nagging kind of behavior. But really what it is anger and frustration that you're not giving them what they want. And if you can think of it like that, if you can conceptualize it like that, it will help you to really be able to meet your child's needs. You don't necessarily have to give them what they want when they're nagging and nagging you, but you'll be able to say, well, let me think about how to deal with this. So, for example, if they're nagging you, please can I do this? Please can I have some candy? Please can I have some candy? Please can I have some candy? You don't necessarily have to say, sure, you can have some candy, but you could say to your child, I know you're very angry that I'm not giving you candy, and I know how much you want candy, but I'm really sorry I'm not giving you candy right now because you've had candy the last 3 days in a row, or because we don't have candy, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So what could we do instead that would help you take your mind off candy, and so you don't have to be so frustrated and angry with me? Maybe we could play a game together. Maybe we can go for a walk. It'll help you to meet your child's needs, their emotional needs, and stop them from nagging you. If you can understand what the emotional mechanism is that's going on that's making them nag and nag and nag. The other thing is that I would love it if you could ask yourself if you role model nagging for your child, because so many times that's what we're doing and we don't realize it. So, for example, are you nagging your child to clean up her room 500 times a day? Are you nagging them to, pick up their shoes? Are you nagging them to do their homework? And yes, definitely we have to ask our kids to do these things because they ignore us otherwise. But if 80% of your interactions with your child are nagging interactions, and only 20% of them are positive, happy, fruitful interactions, then possibly what your relationship is with your child is you nagging him and him nagging you. And maybe that's what the relationship has become, rather than a more upbeat, positive, interactive relationship. So it's important to think about that. Have you gone into a nagging mode, and is your child nagging you back because of that? And is that the way you connect to each other? So, and then the other thing is you want to think about not giving in to nagging, because the more you just give into it, the more it reinforces the nagging. Like if your child says to you, whatever they want, can they have candy, and you say yes, then certainly the next day they're going to nag and nag and nag because they know that eventually you'll give in. And you have to think about that sense of consistency that we talked about earlier. The more you are consistent about things that are important, the less likely you are to have a nagger. So I think I'm going to stop here and see if we have any nagging questions.
Okay, we have a question about why questions, that my son just repeats why over and over. Is it okay to limit that? What should I do about that?
Little kids definitely, certainly 3- and 4-year-olds certainly do that frequently, and sometimes even older kids. And it depends on your child, and it depends on what's coming out of it. If the why questions are fruitful, and if your child seems to really benefit from your responses, you may not want to limit it so much. If it's really driving you up a wall, and if it feels like they're just asking why and not even listening to your response, then yeah, I think it's absolutely fine to limit the why questions, because they're not really, they're just kind of probably more habit, and no one's really benefiting from them. And it's okay for you to just change the subject and say, you know what, I've answered that already, and let's talk about something else.
Okay, great. All right, we have another question. Is whining a type of nagging, and how do I stop the whining?
Yes, and I was mentioning that earlier. Whining is definitely a type of nagging. Whining is also a form of sort of suppressed anger, and one of the best ways to stop whining that I have found with kids is to tell your child, stop them mid-whine and say, I can't hear whining, and let's start over again. Tell me what you want to tell me in a not whining voice, or in a big girl voice, and let's try it again. And you almost need to reprogram your child not to whine. And if you let them continue whining, one of the things that I find is that kids whose parents don't help them to stop whining almost become whiners by nature, and then they don't even realize they're whining anymore, and they become teenagers who whine. So it's important to help your child not to whine, not in a negative, punitive way, but in a positive way. So as soon as you hear the whining, to say, well, you know what? I hear the whining. Let's try a do-over with a non-whining voice, and then give your child a lot of reinforcement, positive reinforcement, for saying what they wanted to say without whining.
Great. We have another question about dealing with this. For nagging, whining questions, do kids respond to role-playing, or is it bad to nag back and show them how irritating it can be? I love that. That's hilarious. I think that we as parents find it incredibly fulfilling to role-play the whining and nagging back. But it makes us feel better to show our child how incredibly annoying they're being. But the truth is, I don't think it's productive for your child. I don't think it's helpful to them. And I think, in fact, that it makes them feel worse, because it makes them feel, one, that you're making fun of them. And in most cases,
if you think again about the model that I'm giving you, that nagging and whining are really a form of suppressed anger, that it's going to make your child more angry. And what they really need you to do is to address the issue that they're nagging you about. And not, they don't need you to show them how frustrated you are and how annoying it is. They know how frustrating and annoying it is. That's actually the reason they're doing it, to try and get you to change your mind. What they need you to do is address the issue head on. So for you to say to them, you know what, I hear that you're angry, I hear that you're frustrated, you got to stop nagging me and whining me because I'm not going to change my mind, but what can we do to help you feel less frustrated and angry? I'm not going to change my mind about this, so you need to stop nagging. Just address it head on. I think that kind of role-playing is just going to really annoy them and is going to cause a deterioration in the interaction between you.
All right. Well, our question asker wrote back and said, thanks for the answer, although it is sometimes more fun to nag back.
I agree. I definitely think it's more fun.
Know what you mean.
It is. I agree wholeheartedly.
So that's all our questions for this section.
Okay, good. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk for a couple of minutes about we want to encourage communication. That's our whole goal, is for the way you answer your child's questions to encourage communication between you and them. So let's first talk about the things that you should do. So the first thing you want to do is listen very carefully to the details of the questions. In particular, you want to listen for the questions that your child might ask that are worried, anxious type of questions. If your child is asking you a lot of those questions, you want to really tune in, because it means there's something going on in your child's life that's upsetting them, that's worrying them, maybe something in school, something with a friend, and you want to really ask, really dig deep and figure out what's going on in those details. The next thing is you want to focus fully on your child when they're asking you questions, and in general when they're talking to you. We live such crazy, hectic lives, but as much as you possibly can, you want to be fully present when your child is talking to you. And when we get to the don'ts, we're going to talk more about that. But you want to just be, I keep saying to tune in, but, one of the things I remember, my kids are older now, but when they were really little, I used to say to them, okay, I want you to put on your listening ears now and listen to what I'm saying to you. So for those of you who have little kids, I'm sure you're still telling your kids to put on your listening ears. I would like you as a parent to put on your listening ears when your child is asking you questions, so that you can really be tuned in to what they're saying to you. Now, one of the great ways to get your child to talk to you and to ask you more questions and to tell you more is for you to respond to their question with a specific question. So, for example, if your child says to you, Mom, do you think it was fair that, Jimmy was so mean to me, when I started to cry? You might want to say to him, well, did you cry first or did you roll your eyes at him first? If you know that your child is someone who rolls his eyes. Because maybe he was mean because your child rolled his eyes. So you don't always want to answer the question by saying, oh, it was terrible that Jimmy was mean to you. Sometimes you want to ask more questions. And the more questions you ask, and you can keep asking questions. You can wait a long time before you give an answer. And you might find at the end of your question asking that your answer will be very, very different than it would have been if you'd answered immediately. So you want to keep asking and keep asking and keep asking before you finally give an answer. And last, you want to take your child's question very seriously. Sometimes your child will ask a question that seems trivial to you, seems silly to you as an adult, but for your child, if they're asking you the question, for them it's a serious question, and you want to really take it seriously, because the questions that they're asking you now when they're little may be trivial, but as they become older and become teenagers, the questions they're going to be asking you will be more serious questions. But if you've built a foundation of taking everything they say seriously, they're going to be much more likely to come to you with serious concerns if they feel like they can trust you to take them seriously. And it's essential that you start that now. The window for gaining your child's trust is a very small window. By early adolescence, the window has closed. And if you haven't built on it and built on it and built on it, and you don't have that good trust with you and your child, it's very, very difficult to build it in the teen years. So you want to take everything they say to you seriously and really build on that relationship. So now, let's look at the don'ts that will shut down communication between you and your child. So the first one is that you don't want to become distracted or bored or impatient. So, if your child is asking you a question, you don't want to look bored. You don't want to be impatient. Hurry up, hurry up. What's your question? You started, ask me the question already. Sometimes kids take a long time to finally get to the question. And you want to say to them, could you just ask the question? No. You want to listen. You want to keep your listening ears turned on. You want to be tuned in and not get impatient with them. Because if you get impatient, they're going to shut down, and they're going to find someone else to ask their question to. The next thing, and, again, this goes back to what we were saying before, is please turn off the phone, turn off the email, don't text. Sometimes we're doing those things without even thinking that we're doing them. We're not even recognizing. I think we become so sort of attached to our phones and our PDAs that we can't get rid of them no matter what. So it's important to become conscious that when your child is talking to you, asking you questions, that you put the thing down so that you're not even tempted when you feel the buzz to check to see who's emailing you. And really tune into what your child is asking you or telling you. The next thing is you don't want to make your child feel that the question isn't important. So you don't want to say to them, that's no big deal. That's a silly question. Or, don't worry about that. That's not a big deal. You always want to make them feel that what they're asking you is important and that you do value it and that, what, that was a big deal that they asked you that, and you appreciate that they asked you that question, and you want to respond in a way that makes them feel that you value the question and that you're going to give them a response that was a valuable response. And then last, in a similar vein, if you don't know something, an answer to a question that your child is asking, and you tell them, what, I'll find out, don't forget to find out. Again, you want to make them feel that what they're asking you is important to you. Or if the response that they require is a response that requires some time, don't rush it. Give them the time that they need. Your goal is not just for the now, but it's for the whole rest of your relationship with your child. Your goal is to really make sure that you and your child have a strong bond going into the future, so that when the questions are tough questions, when they're older, or questions that require trust, that they'll be willing to ask them, and you'll be there to answer them. So here's one very last question before we go to questions. I always want to ask parents, can you imagine a meaningful world without children's questions? And, I really can't. I think it's incredibly important for us to remember at all times that we are raising tomorrow's leaders, tomorrow's questioners, and the people who need to keep asking questions and feel safe enough, good enough, and proud enough to keep asking those questions. And in order to do that, you need to keep nurturing that. So you need to be patient with them, give them the time and space and knowledge that they need to keep being questioners. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to see if we have any final questions.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Bartel. We do. How do you manage answering questions when multiple kids want your attention at the same time? Who do you answer first? How do you deal with an impatient child waiting his or her turn?
Yep, that's always the case when you have more than one child. And, it depends. Sometimes you have to just make them take turns, and you may have to rotate whose turn it is. Sometimes you have to decide which question is more important. Sometimes what I do with my kids is I just see who asked first, and I tell the other two, you have to wait. You've got to just zip your mouth and wait for this one to be finished, and then I promise you I will give you my attention. And I think that if you make sure that you do give everyone the attention that you promise them, they're more likely to be patient. If you give one attention, but then you kind of go up to something else, and you don't give the other one's attention, then they're going to keep fighting. But if you make sure that you do eventually give everyone the attention, and you rotate each day, so who goes first, then they get to be more okay with it. And I think with age, that gets better. Impulse control gets better with age.
All right. Well, speaking of as kids get older, or maybe not, this might be about a younger kid too. Sometimes when I don't give in or give my child an answer he doesn't like, he says, "I hate you," and storms to his room. How do I deal with it when a child's anger reaches that point?
Yeah, that sounds probably more like an 8 or a 9-year-old. That's a very manipulative response. Kids who say, I hate you, and storm to their room are typically being manipulative and are trying to make you feel bad so that you'll change your mind. And you have to recognize that and tough it out and not allow your child to be manipulative. And it's okay for them to feel like that. It's okay for them to be angry. It's sort of similar to nagging. They don't really hate you. What they're really feeling is angry. And it's okay for you to give them some space in their room, and say to them, it's okay for you to be angry, but I'm not changing my mind. And I wouldn't dwell on the I hate you part. I think that, truthfully, kids say that stuff a lot, and a lot of parents' feelings get very hurt and they get very upset about that. But I think if you don't dwell on it, they'll realize it doesn't have the power, and they'll be less likely to do it.
All right. Great. You know what? We have more than one person who's asked something about how much information to give a child when they have questions about a parent or a relative who's fighting cancer, or we have a couple different questions about it, but along those lines, when it's that really sort of hard thing.
Okay, yeah, and actually that is a question that I get a lot. It depends on the age of the child, and it depends on how ill the person is. If it's a very close relative or not. So let's say, assuming it's a very close relative, like a grandparent who your child is close to, and if they are very, very ill and are going to die, I'm just going to say, for the sake of this conversation, and they're going to die soon, you need to tell your child something along those lines. Your child needs an opportunity to understand what's going on. If it's a long illness, and the person has cancer or a serious illness, but it's going to last a very, very, very long time, you don't need to give your child that kind of information. Even an older child doesn't need huge amounts of information if it's an illness that's going to go on for years, or even for for younger kids, even for 6 months or more. But if the person is going to die within a few weeks or a couple of months, and you know that for a fact, then your child, if they are close to that person, needs an opportunity to know what's going on and to be able to prepare for it and say goodbye to them.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Bartel. That is actually all of the questions that we have. So that's a sad but important note for us to end on. So thank you so much for all of this really valuable information that you've given.
Oh, my pleasure.
Tonight. And thanks to everyone out there for joining us. You're now all entered to win Dr. Bartel's book, which I know everyone will really enjoy. So be on the lookout for an email from Kiwi to see if you've won. And also please check out kiwimagonline.com/college to see our past webinars and sign up for the ones we're having in the future. So thank you again, Dr. Bartel, and to all of you for attending. And enjoy your evening, everyone.